There is a kind of loneliness that not even the vast desert can explain. The August heat lashed the barren land when Thomas Mitchell arrived at the property he had blindly bought by telegram. The man carried 42 years of hard life on his back, marked by scars that told stories he preferred to forget. Her blue eyes reflected the faded color of a sky that promised rain but never delivered. The barn towered towering against the golden horizon, its wooden planks bravely resisting the constant winds that swept through that forgotten region. Thomas had bought the property from a widow who had moved to the city, looking for a place where he could start over away from the memories that had haunted him since the war. When he pushed open the heavy barn doors, he expected to find old hay and abandoned tools. What he found would change the course of his life forever. 4 female silhouettes emerged from the shadows as apparitions born from the earth itself. They were sisters. This was clear from the similarity in the delicate features and in the hair that shone like ripe wheat under the rays of the sun that infiltrated through the cracks in the wood. The eldest seemed to be about 25 years old, while the youngest had barely left adolescence behind. Martha, the eldest, stepped forward. His green eyes shone with a mixture of curiosity and determination that made Thomas instinctively retreat. Clara, the second, kept her hands clasped together, her brown hair framing a face that radiated natural gentleness. Rose, the third, watched with penetrating intensity, as if she could see through a man's soul. And Sarah, the youngest, hid partially behind her sisters, her large dark eyes reflecting an innocence that seemed impossible in this wild place. The silence stretched like a rope about to break. The wind made the barn's wood creak in a melancholy melody that echoed through the empty fields. Thomas felt his heart race, not from fear, but from something much deeper and more disturbing. It was then that Martha uttered the words that would become the echo of her nightmares and dreams. "You belong to all of us tonight." Her voice carried a strange mixture of command and supplication, as if it were both an order and a desperate request. Thomas noticed that their clothes were simple but neat, that their faces had the paleness of those who rarely saw sunlight, and that there was in the eyes of all of them a hunger that was not for food. The air inside the barn seemed denser, loaded with expectations and undisclosed secrets. The floorboards groaned under the weight of 5 people who looked at each other as if they were on opposite sides of an impassable abyss. Thomas swallowed, feeling the metallic taste of fear mixed with a curiosity that grew like fire in dry straw. The sun began to set outside, painting the cracks in the wood with orange tones that danced on the faces of the 4 sisters. Each of them seemed to carry a mystery of its own, an untold story that vibrated in the air like the distant buzzing of bees. Thomas realized at that moment that his simple life as a man in search of peace had come to an end. Fate had prepared for him something far more complex and dangerous than any battle he had faced. The 4 sisters continued to stare at him, and he knew there was no way back. Night was approaching, and with it, truths that would change everything he thought he knew about loneliness, desire, and the mysterious nature of the human heart. Fear has the smell of old wood and damp hay. Thomas remained motionless, feeling the weight of the 8 eyes that studied him with an intensity that made his skin tingle. The golden light of the evening filtered through the cracks of the barn, creating streaks of light that cut through the room like silent blades. The air was charged with a tension he had never experienced, not even on the battlefields where he had learned that life and death went hand in hand. Martha took another step toward her, and Thomas noticed how she moved with a strange grace, as if she wasn't used to walking in open spaces. Her bare feet touched the wooden floor, with a delicacy that contrasted with the firmness in her voice. "Mother told us that one day a man would come," said Clara, her voice soft as the murmur of the wind among the trees. "She said we'd know when that day came." Rose tilted her head, studying Thomas as if he were an exotic creature that had emerged from the desert itself. "You don't look like what she described," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Sarah, the youngest, finally came out from behind the sisters. Her steps were hesitant, but there was a curiosity shining in her dark eyes that propelled her forward. "He has scars," he observed, with the cruel innocence of youth, like the ones Mum said all men carry. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. The way they talked about it, as if it were an object of study, a piece in a puzzle that only they knew, made every survival instinct she had developed over the years scream for her to run. But something stronger kept him there, planted in the ground like an ancient tree. "Where is your mother?" she managed to ask, her voice coming out hoarser than she intended. The silence that followed was so deep that Thomas could hear his own heart beating against his ribs. The four sisters exchanged meaningful looks, a silent communication that spoke of years lived in isolation, depending only on each other. "Mother left last spring," Martha replied, and there was an old pain in her voice that made Thomas feel a pang in his chest. "She said that when our time came, we would know what to do." Clara moved closer, and Thomas noticed that his hands trembled slightly. "We've never seen a real man before," he confessed in a whisper, "only in the stories that Mum told." The revelation hit Thomas like a punch in the stomach. He then understood why they moved so strangely, why his eyes shone with such a mixture of fear and fascination. They had been brought up in complete isolation from the outside world, knowing only the stories their mother had told them about mythical creatures called men. Rose held out her hand, hesitantly, as if she wanted to touch his face to confirm that it was real. Thomas remained motionless, allowing her delicate fingers to graze the scar that cut through her left cheek, a permanent reminder of a Confederate bullet that had nearly cost her life. "It's hot," muttered Rose, amazed, "and rough, like the bark of trees." Sarah laughed, a crystal-clear sound that echoed through the rafters of the barn. "Mom was right. They are different from us." Thomas felt something break inside his chest when he saw the pure innocence of these women. They had grown up in a world where only they existed, protected and at the same time prisoners of a maternal love that had kept them away from all the brutality and beauty of real life. "Have you never left this place?" he asked softly. Martha shook her head. "Mum said there was danger outside, that men were creatures of violence and desire. But I also said that one day we'd need one to—" She hesitated, her face blushing slightly. "What for?" Thomas insisted, though he was already suspicious of the answer. "To give us children," Clara added simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "so that our lineage continues." Thomas's world seemed to tilt on its own axis. He finally understood the meaning of Martha's words, the reason why they had received it, as if it were a gift sent from heaven. To them, he wasn't just a man. He was the answer to a motherly prophecy, the key to a future they had been taught to hope for without question. The wind blew stronger outside, making the barn groan like a ship on the high seas. And Thomas knew he was about to sail into waters far more dangerous than any ocean he had ever crossed. Some moments in a man's life divide his existence between before and after. Thomas watched the delicate movement of the four sisters around him, each gesture revealing years of shared life in absolute secrecy. They communicated through looks and soft touches, a silent language developed in isolation. Martha held Clara's hand, who in turn touched Rose's shoulder, while Sarah remained close to everyone, forming a human chain of mutual protection. The barn had become something much more than a simple wooden construction. Thomas noticed small details that had gone unnoticed in his first moment of shock. Corners arranged with maternal care, where colourful blankets folded into perfect piles. Ceramic jars lined up against a wall, containing dried herbs that perfumed the air with fragrances of lavender and rosemary. A small area where embers still smoked in a circle of stones, indicating that the sisters had recently prepared a meal. This was not just a temporary shelter. It was a home, built in hiding, a miniature world where four women had grown up and matured away from the prying eyes of civilization. Thomas began to grasp the magnitude of what their mother had done, creating a parallel universe where her daughters could exist without ever knowing the cruelty or beauty of the outside world. Martha walked away from the group and walked to one of the barn walls. With precise movements, he pushed away some loose boards, revealing a secret compartment. From there, he pulled out a small, ornate chest, its hinges creaking softly when it was opened. Thomas saw papers yellowed by time, faded photographs, and personal effects that looked like relics of a previous life. The eldest of the sisters took a photograph from the trunk and held it to her chest for a moment, as if gathering courage. Then he approached Thomas and showed him the image. It was the portrait of a middle-aged woman, with features that echoed in the faces of her 4 daughters. His eyes carried a deep sadness, but also an iron determination that Thomas recognized immediately. Clara joined Martha, carrying in her hands a set of folded papers with extreme care. They were letters, Thomas realized, written in elegant feminine handwriting. The pages were yellowed by tears and time, each word a bridge between the world they had left behind and the uncertain future that awaited them. Rose brought a small Bible, its pages marked by years of constant reading. Thomas noticed that certain passages were underlined with faded ink, probably the stories that the mother had used to teach her daughters about the outside world, without ever allowing them to experience it directly. Sarah, the youngest, held a golden medallion that shone faintly in the light that seeped through the cracks in the barn. Inside, Thomas could make out the portrait of a young man with a neatly trimmed mustache and gentle eyes. She instinctively understood that this was the father of the sisters, someone whose memory had been preserved in secrecy and reverence. The weight of responsibility began to settle on Thomas's shoulders like a blanket of lead. These women were not just 4 isolated sisters waiting for a casual visitor. They were the guardians of a complex history, heirs to a legacy that involved love, loss, and a maternal courage that defied all conventional logic. He watched as each of them moved with a determined purpose, setting the stage for something they had clearly mentally rehearsed for years. Blankets were spread on the floor, forming a circular area in the center of the barn. Candles were lit and strategically placed, creating an atmosphere that was both sacred and intimate. Martha returned to the trunk and took from it a white dress, simple but elegant, which seemed to have been preserved especially for the occasion. Clara did the same, followed by Rose and Sarah. The dresses were identical, hand-sewn with love and expectation, each stitch a silent prayer for a future that finally materializes. Thomas felt his heart race as he realized he was witnessing a ritual that had been prepared for years, a ceremony created by the fertile imagination of a mother, desperate to make sure her daughters didn't die alone in isolation. The barn had been transformed into a makeshift chapel, and he was at once the guest of honor and the willing sacrifice. The wind outside increased in intensity, causing the barn planks to sing a melancholy melody that seemed to accompany the ritualized movements of the 4 sisters. Thomas realized that he had crossed an invisible line from which there would be no return. The man who had entered the barn looking for a simple fresh start was no more. The human heart recognizes its destiny before the mind understands its nature. The 4 sisters had transformed into ethereal creatures inside the white dresses that floated like mist around their delicate bodies. The candlelight danced on their faces, creating shadows that sometimes made them look like angels, sometimes ghosts of a past they never lived. Thomas stood motionless in the center of the circle they had formed, feeling like a castaway surrounded by mermaids who sang songs in a language he could not fully comprehend. Martha was the first to approach. His steps were slow and deliberate, as if he were walking towards a sacred altar. Her hands touched Thomas's face with a bow that made something deep move inside his chest. It was a touch of discovery, as if she were reading a map written in an ancestral language that only the female heart could decipher. Clara came next, her fingers exploring the scars that marked Thomas's arms. Each mark told a story of pain and survival, and she touched them as if they were sacred runes engraved by life itself. There was a tenderness in his movements that contrasted with the intensity of the moment, a gentleness that Thomas had not experienced since his mother had died, when he was still a boy full of dreams that war would take care of destroying. Rose positioned herself behind him, her hands resting on Thomas's tense shoulders. She possessed a silent force that radiated through her touch, as if she could absorb years of accumulated fatigue just through contact. Thomas felt his muscles relax for the first time in decades, as if he could finally let down the guard he had held up since the battlefields. Sarah, the youngest, stood in front of him, her large, dark eyes studying every detail of his face with the sheer curiosity of youth. There was something different about the way she observed him, a connection that transcended the experience shared with the sisters. Thomas felt his heart race when her eyes met his, recognizing something she didn't fully understand herself. The ritual proceeded in absolute silence, broken only by the sounds of creaking wood and the wind rustling through the cracks of the barn. The sisters moved, as if they were dancing a choreography rehearsed all their lives, each gesture flowing naturally into the next. Thomas realized that he was participating in something much deeper than a simple encounter between strangers. Martha brought a bowl of warm water, scented with herbs, and began to wash Thomas's hands with ritualized movements. The water dripped between his calloused fingers, carrying with it years of not only physical, but spiritual dirt. It was as if she was purifying not only his body, but his soul, tired of carrying the weight of so many lost battles. Clara combed her grey hair with a carved wooden comb, each movement soft and hypnotic. Thomas closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel the simple pleasure of being cared for. Something he had forgotten existed. Her delicate fingers massaged his scalp, awakening sensations he had buried under layers of pragmatism and survival. Rose brought clean, simple, but well-groomed clothes and helped Thomas strip off the dusty garments of the journey. There was no embarrassment or urgency in his movements, just a naturalness that spoke of an innocence preserved through the years of isolation. To them, this was not seduction in the sense that Thomas knew it, but rather an act of sacred service. As Sarah approached again, Thomas felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. She carried in her hands a simple necklace made of wooden beads polished by time and constant touch. When she put him around his neck, her fingers brushed against Thomas's skin, sending waves of heat that spread all over his body. At that moment, Thomas understood that he was not falling in love with the four sisters as a set, but with Sarah specifically. There was something about her quiet intensity, the way her eyes seemed to see straight through all the defenses he had built up over the years. It was as if she could see the man he had been before the war, before the scars, before the fatigue settled in his bones like rust. The barn was filled with an energy that Thomas had never experienced. It was a mixture of sacred and profane, of innocence and desire, of past and future meeting in a moment suspended in time. The candles continued to burn, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls, as four women and a man discovered together what it meant to be truly human. Outside, night had completely fallen, enveloping the barn in a cloak of darkness that protected them from the outside world. Thomas knew that when the sun rose again, nothing would be the same as before. Something had been awakened that night that would change the course of 5 lives forever. True love does not come like a storm, but like the first ray of sunshine after the long night. Dawn painted the sky with rosy hues that seeped through the cracks in the barn, revealing 5 people transformed by the previous night's experience. Thomas awoke to find Sarah lying beside him, her serene face illuminated by the soft morning light. Around them, Martha, Clara, and Rose slept peacefully, as if they had finally found the purpose their mother had promised existed. Sarah's eyes slowly opened, meeting Thomas's with a naturalness that spoke of a deeper connection than any words could express. There was no embarrassment or regret in his gaze, just a silent certainty that something precious had been born between them during the dark hours they had passed. Thomas reached out and gently touched her face, marveling at the softness of the skin that had never been punished by the merciless desert sun. Sarah smiled, a smile that contained all the preserved innocence of a sheltered life, but also the ancestral wisdom that all women carry in their hearts from birth. The other sisters gradually awoke, and Thomas watched as they looked at Sarah with a mixture of joy and melancholy. They instinctively understood that something had changed during the night, that the youngest had found what they were all looking for, but that only one could truly possess. Martha stood up with the dignity of a queen abdicating her throne, approaching Thomas and Sarah with measured steps. She placed her hand on her younger sister's shoulder, a gesture that carried blessing and farewell at the same time. His eyes reflected a mature acceptance, as if he always knew that this moment would come, and that his role would be to guide the sisters to him, not beyond him. Clara joined the group, carrying in her hands the trunk of memories they had shared the night before. From inside, he took out a simple wedding ring made of time-worn gold, which had belonged to their mother. With ceremonial movements, she placed it in Thomas's hand, a gift that symbolized the transfer of responsibilities and the beginning of a new family. Rose brought wildflowers she had gathered from the fields around the barn during the first moments of dawn. They were simple flowers, but their vibrant colors contrasted beautifully with the aged wood of the barn. She intertwined them in Sarah's hair, creating a natural crown that transformed her from a sheltered girl to a woman ready to take on the world. The sound of horses' hooves echoed outside, and Thomas stood up to investigate. Through a crack in the wall, he saw 3 men approaching the barn, their mounts kicking up clouds of golden dust into the morning air. He recognized them as the Hartwell brothers, men he had met on his travels and who were also looking for a fresh start away from the memories of the war. Martha, Clara, and Rose exchanged meaningful glances, and Thomas realized that this was not a casual encounter. The sisters had sent messages, prepared this moment with the same meticulousness with which they had prepared the ritual of the previous night. They knew they couldn't stay forever in that barn, living off the memories and hopes left by their mother. The 3 men entered the barn with evident respect, removing their hats and bowing slightly before the women. James Hartwell, the eldest, had gentle eyes that immediately fixed on Martha. William, the one in the middle, smiled sheepishly at Clara, while Samuel, the youngest, couldn't look away from Rose. Thomas observed how the sisters responded to the presence of the new visitors. There was an opening in their hearts that had not existed before, as if the experience of the night before had broken down the barriers that kept them prisoners of their own isolation. They were ready to discover the world their mother had kept away from them for so many years. Sarah stood beside Thomas, her hand clasped in his with a soft possessiveness that spoke of a love that had blossomed quickly, but with deep roots. Thomas felt a peace descending on his weary heart like fresh rain after a long drought. For the first time in decades, he could glimpse a future that wasn't haunted by the ghosts of the past. The barn, which for one night had been a secret sanctuary and a place of revelations, began to transform again. The blankets were folded, the candles extinguished, the white dresses carefully guarded as relics of a ceremony that had changed the fate of all those present. When they left the barn that morning, there were 4 couples walking toward a new life. The surrounding properties would become homes where love would bloom like wildflowers after a spring storm. The 4 sisters, who had spent their entire lives knowing only each other, would discover the joy of building families of their own, but always maintaining the bonds that had united them since birth. Thomas looked back one last time before mounting his horse with Sarah sitting in front of him. The barn stood there, solid and silent, guarding the secrets of a night that had proved that sometimes fate knows our hearts better than we know ourselves. The sun rose over the horizon, promising warm days and starry nights for the new couples who rode towards the future. And somewhere, in the wind that swept across the golden fields, Thomas could swear he heard the contented laughter of a mother who had planned everything perfectly, even after she had departed this world. If you enjoyed this exciting story of the Wild West, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more adventures like this. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any episodes of our Western narratives.